I turned 40 and threw myself a birthday party. No one came, not even my wife. A week later, my wife sent me a $1,800 bill for her dad's party. No apology, just Venmo Epsilon. I sent $1, cut them off, and 2 days later the cops were at my office door. So here's the thing about turning 40. Everyone acts like it's supposed to be this massive milestone, right? Like you've officially graduated from young and stupid to distinguished and wise, or some bullshit like that. Well, let me tell you what 40 actually feels like. It feels like standing in your bathroom mirror at 6:30 in the morning, staring at gray hairs that definitely weren't there last week, wondering when exactly you became the kind of person who gets genuinely excited about a good night's sleep. But you know what? Screw that noise. I decided I wasn't going to let this birthday slip by like some forgettable Tuesday in March. No, sir. Jared Blake was going to celebrate himself for once, and he wasn't going to sit around waiting for other people to make it happen. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my almost 4 decades on this spinning rock, it's that if you want something done right, you better damn well do it yourself. So I did what any self-respecting man hitting the big 4-0 would do. I went full throttle planning mode. We're talking military precision here, people. I spent 3 weeks researching venues, and let me tell you, finding the perfect spot in this city is like trying to find a decent parking space at the mall during Christmas. Nearly impossible and way more expensive than it should be. But I finally found it. This intimate little lounge downtown called Velvet Room. The kind of place with exposed brick walls, warm amber lighting that makes everyone look like they stepped out of a whiskey commercial, and most importantly, a live saxophonist who could make even the phone book sound romantic. I'm not gonna lie, I felt pretty damn proud of myself booking that place. The manager, this cool woman named Sophia with purple streaks in her hair, gave me the full tour and talked about how they'd set up the space just right. We're talking mood lighting that would make Sinatra jealous, cocktail tables positioned perfectly for mingling, and a small stage where the sax player could work his magic. She even suggested the perfect spot for the cake, right under this gorgeous vintage chandelier that cast these amazing shadows on the walls. Speaking of the cake, I spent way too much time at the bakery explaining exactly what I wanted. The baker, this elderly Italian guy named Giuseppe who clearly thought I was nuts for caring so much about frosting consistency, finally understood my vision. Simple but elegant, chocolate base with vanilla buttercream, and written in bold letters across the top. Jared, still rising. Yeah, maybe it was a little cheesy, but you know what? Sometimes a man needs to be his own hype squad. Then came the invitations. I crafted these things like I was announcing the royal wedding or something. Classy cardstock, elegant font, the whole 9 yards. I sent them to everyone who mattered, my parents, my college buddies, my work crew, a few neighbors who'd become genuine friends over the years. But the most important invitation? That one went to Marisol, my wife of 8 years, the woman who was supposed to be my partner in all this life craziness. I had this whole vision, you see. I could picture her walking in wearing that red dress she looks absolutely killer in. The one she wore to her cousin's wedding last year that made every guy in the room forget their own names. I imagined her laughing at my cake message, rolling her eyes in that affectionate way she used to do when I'd get overly excited about something stupid. I pictured us toasting with champagne, her giving one of those speeches that would make everyone remember why they loved us as a couple. Hell, I even imagined the saxophone playing The Way You Look Tonight, while we danced in that little space near the bar. The night arrived, and I showed up at 6:30 sharp, dressed in my best suit, the navy one that actually fits properly since I started hitting the gym again. The place looked perfect. Sophia had outdone herself with the setup, the lighting was absolutely perfect, and the saxophonist was already warming up with some smooth Miles Davis. I positioned myself near the entrance like some eager host at a house party, checking my watch and my phone every 30 seconds. 7 o'clock rolled around. No problem, right? People are fashionably late these days. Everyone's stuck in traffic or looking for parking or whatever. I ordered a beer from Nico, the bartender. This laid-back dude with sleeve tattoos who looked like he'd seen every kind of human drama play out in his bar. He poured me a perfect pint and gave me this knowing nod that said, "Don't worry, man, they'll show." 8 o'clock came and went. The saxophonist switched from upbeat jazz to something slower, more mellow. Maybe people were running really late. Maybe there was some massive traffic jam I hadn't heard about. I checked the group text I'd sent with all the details, delivered, but nobody was responding. I called my buddy Marcus, straight to voicemail. Tried my sister Jenny, same thing. Even texted my mom, who usually responds faster than a teenager with a crush. By 9 o'clock, the truth hit me like a freight train loaded with disappointment and wrapped in embarrassment. Nobody was coming. Not my college friends who I'd stayed in touch with for 20 years. Not my work buddies who I'd covered for during their personal emergencies. Not my family who I'd been there for through divorces and job losses and every other crisis life had thrown their way. And most painful of all, not Marisol. Not my wife, who was supposed to be my ride or die, my constant, my person. I sat there in that beautiful lounge, surrounded by empty chairs and tables set for guests who clearly had better things to do, and tried to process what the hell had just happened. The saxophonist was playing something slow and melancholy now, like he could sense the mood shift in the room. Other patrons were stealing glances at me. The guy sitting alone at what was obviously supposed to be a party, looking like the saddest birthday boy in the history of birthday boys. Nico, bless his soul, must have recognized the situation for what it was. He walked over with a rocks glass filled with what looked like top-shelf bourbon and set it down in front of me. For the birthday man, he said simply, no pity in his voice, just recognition. That's when I knew I either had to laugh or cry, and laughing seemed like the better option for my dignity. I walked over to my perfect cake, sitting there under that gorgeous chandelier like some monument to misplaced optimism. I cut myself one slice, a generous one, because screw portion control on your birthday, and sat back down at my table. I ate that cake slowly, savoring every bite of Giuseppe's excellent work, pretending the scattered groups of other customers weren't occasionally glancing over with that particular mix of curiosity and sympathy that made my skin crawl. The worst part wasn't even the eating cake alone thing. The worst part was walking out of there afterward, thanking Sophia for a lovely evening like everything had gone according to plan, tipping Nico extra for his kindness, and making that long walk to my car in the parking garage. Every step felt like I was walking through molasses, like the universe was making damn sure I felt every second of that humiliation. Sitting in my car afterward, key in the ignition but not turning it yet, I stared at the concrete wall in front of me and tried to figure out what the hell had just happened to my life. When exactly did I become the kind of person whose 40th birthday party turned into a solo dining experience? When did I become so invisible that even the people who were supposed to love me most couldn't be bothered to show up for 2 hours on one night? The drive home felt like emerging from a really bad dream, except I was wide awake, and this was my actual life. 40 and invisible. Happy fucking birthday to me. A week passed after my spectacular birthday disaster, and I'd almost convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, life could go back to some semblance of normal. You know that feeling when you stub your toe really hard, and for a few seconds you think it might not hurt that bad, then the pain hits like a sledgehammer? Yeah, that's basically what happened to my emotional state when my phone decided to ruin my Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in the most boring quarterly budget meeting known to mankind, listening to Janet from accounting drone on about expense reports and cost-cutting measures, when my phone buzzed against my leg. Now, normally I'm pretty disciplined about ignoring personal stuff during work hours. I'm not one of those people who checks Instagram while pretending to care about profit margins. But something about that particular buzz felt different. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was just bad luck, but I decided to sneak a quick peek. The message was from Marisol, and the preview made my stomach drop faster than a lead balloon. Hey, we're doing Dad's milestone at Lakeside. $1,800 each. I excused myself from the meeting, mumbling something about a bathroom emergency that wasn't entirely a lie considering how my digestive system was reacting to this news. I found an empty conference room and opened the full message, and let me tell you, it was a masterpiece of audacity wrapped in casual entitlement. Hey, we're doing Dad's milestone at Lakeside. $1,800 each. Venmo me by Friday. That was it. No. Hey honey, how are you doing? No, sorry your birthday party was a complete bust, because we all suck as human beings. No explanation, no discussion, no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, asking someone for $1,800 might warrant an actual conversation. Just a bill. A fucking invoice disguised as a family text. And here's the thing about Gregory Hale, my father-in-law. The man loves grand gestures the way most people love breathing. We're talking about a guy who once rented out an entire restaurant for his wife's birthday, complete with a string quartet and ice sculptures, because apparently regular birthday dinners are for peasants. Don't get me wrong, Gregory's not a bad guy. He's just got this idea that every life event needs to be celebrated like he's planning the Met Gala. His wife Patrice, on the other hand, that woman has turned other people's generosity into an art form. She's got this magical ability to make everyone around her feel like funding her elaborate schemes is not just expected, but somehow a privilege. Like you should be grateful for the opportunity to drop nearly $2,000 on someone else's party. She's the type of person who says things like, family invests in family, with a straight face, while somehow never being the one doing the actual investing. I watched the family group chat light up like a Christmas tree with responses. First came Bianca, Marisol's younger sister, with her predictably enthusiastic paid. Can't wait. Party popper, party popper, party popper. Because of course Bianca was already on board. That girl treats family expenses like a competitive sport where the goal is to pay the fastest and act the most excited about it. She probably had her Venmo finger ready before the message even finished sending. Then Trevor, Marisol's older brother, chimed in with a thumbs-up emoji and all set. Trevor's one of those guys who communicates exclusively in emoji and three-word phrases, like he's constantly trying to conserve his energy for more important things, like his fantasy football league or whatever crypto scheme he's currently convinced will make him rich. I stared at that group chat for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching everyone enthusiastically throw money at Gregory's milestone celebration while I sat there remembering my empty birthday party. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at a family gathering, which, apparently, I wouldn't be invited to anyway unless I paid for the privilege. Something inside me just snapped, not in a loud, dramatic way. More like a quiet, decisive click, like a door closing that you know isn't going to open again anytime soon. I scrolled back up to Marisol's message, hit reply, and typed exactly what my brain was thinking, $1, with the note congratulations. $1. One single, solitary dollar. Because technically, that's still paying my share of something, right? And honestly, it felt like exactly what this situation was worth. But I wasn't done. Oh no, I was just getting started on what would become the most liberating afternoon I'd had in years. I muted that family group chat faster than you'd mute a car alarm at 3 in the morning. Then I opened my banking app and started systematically cutting off financial access like I was performing surgery on my own wallet. First, I removed Marisol as an authorized user on my credit card. You know, that card she'd been using for household expenses that somehow always included things like Monty Python and boutique purchases that had absolutely nothing to do with keeping our house running. Then I canceled the spare card she kept in the kitchen drawer, the one she claimed was for emergencies, but seemed to be used for a suspiciously large number of non-emergency Starbucks runs. Next up was Zelle access to our joint account, because apparently our joint account had become less joint and more Jared's money that everyone else has access to. I turned off her ability to transfer money faster than she could say, but it's for family. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like I was taking my life back one security setting at a time. Every password change, every access revocation, every protective measure I put in place felt like building a wall around my sanity. When I was done playing financial defense, I did something I hadn't done in years. I booked myself a hotel room, not because I was leaving Marisol permanently, but because I needed space to think without someone asking me to fund their thoughts. I chose a nice place downtown, nothing fancy but clean and quiet, with room service and cable TV and absolutely zero family members asking for money. Before I left the office, I cleaned out my desk drawer and found my house key, the one I'd carried for 8 years of marriage like some symbol of domestic stability. I drove home, walked into our kitchen, and left that key in the little ceramic dish by the door where we always left mail and receipts and other random life detritus. Then I grabbed a bag, threw in enough clothes for a few days, and walked out of my own house like I was leaving someone else's life behind. The hotel room was perfect, quiet, clean, and most importantly mine. I ordered room service, a ridiculous burger with truffle fries that cost way too much and tasted like freedom, and settled in for my first peaceful evening in longer than I could remember. For the first time in years, silence felt like oxygen instead of suffocation. No family group chats buzzing with requests. No guilt trips disguised as conversations. No invoices masquerading as invitations. Just me, an overpriced burger, and the beautiful sound of absolutely nothing. 2 days of hotel room peace had done wonders for my mental state, let me tell you. I was actually starting to feel like a human being again instead of a walking ATM with abandonment issues. I'd slept better than I had in months, eaten meals without anyone asking me to split the check for someone else's lifestyle choices, and even managed to catch up on some work without the constant background noise of family financial drama. So naturally, the universe decided it was time to screw with me again. I was sitting in our glass conference room. The one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that make you feel like you're in a fishbowl, but also make the space feel bigger than it actually is, going over quarterly numbers with Anita Shaw, my team lead. Anita's one of those rare people who actually makes work meetings bearable. She's got this dry sense of humor and doesn't bullshit around with corporate speak, which is probably why we work well together. We were deep in discussion about budget allocations when I noticed something weird happening in the main office area. People were turning their heads toward the reception desk, and there was this subtle shift in the office energy that happens when something unusual is going down. You know that feeling when you're in a restaurant and everyone suddenly gets quiet because there's some drama happening at another table? That's exactly what was happening to our normally boring corporate environment. Then I saw them. 2 uniformed police officers walking through the office like they owned the place, heading straight for our conference room. My first thought was that someone had finally snapped and reported our coffee machine as a public health hazard, because that thing had been making suspicious noises for weeks. My second thought was significantly less optimistic. The taller officer, a black woman with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every type of human stupidity imaginable, knocked on our conference room door with the confident rap of someone who wasn't asking permission. Behind her stood a shorter white guy who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else in the world. "Are you Jared Blake?" the woman asked as she opened the door. Her name tag read, Officer Duramola, and she had the kind of direct eye contact that made you want to confess to crimes you hadn't even committed. I nodded slowly, my brain racing through every possible reason why 2 cops would show up at my workplace. Had someone been hurt? Was there some kind of emergency? Had my hotel stay somehow violated some law I didn't know about? "Sir, we got a report. Welfare check," said the other officer, whose name tag identified him as Officer Finch. "Your wife says you're missing." Missing. Missing. I sat there for a moment processing that word like it was written in a foreign language I was still learning to read. Missing implied that I had disappeared against my will, that something terrible had happened to me, that people were worried about my safety and well-being. What it definitely didn't imply was that I had deliberately removed myself from a toxic situation and was currently living my best life in a hotel room with premium cable and no family group chats. Anita glanced at me with this look that was part concern and part curiosity, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces for. I could practically see her mental gears turning, probably wondering what kind of domestic drama she'd accidentally gotten a front row seat to. "I'm not missing," I said, keeping my voice as flat and professional as possible. "I'm working," which was technically true, since we were literally in the middle of reviewing quarterly budget reports, but I had a feeling these officers weren't here for a lesson in corporate fiscal responsibility. Officer Duramola's expression softened slightly, like she was starting to piece together what was really going on here. "Mind explaining the no contact?" she asked, and I appreciated that she seemed to be treating this as a conversation rather than an interrogation. So I explained. Not the whole pathetic story. Nobody needed to hear about my sad birthday party or the itemized list of family financial abuse I was slowly putting together in my head, but the basics. I talked about setting boundaries, about needing space from people who treated me like a personal bank account, about how family had somehow become a password that gave people unlimited access to my wallet and zero obligation to treat me with basic respect. Officer Finch shifted uncomfortably during my explanation, probably because this was exactly the kind of domestic situation that cops hate dealing with. The messy, complicated stuff where nobody's technically breaking any laws, but everybody's acting like assholes. "Look," Duramola said when I finished. "If you don't call them, they might escalate this. File more reports, maybe claim you're having some kind of mental health crisis. You don't want that kind of paperwork following you around." The implication was clear: handle this before it becomes a bigger problem. But something about the way she said it, and the way Finch kept looking anywhere but directly at me, made me realize they probably thought I was the reasonable one in this situation. Cops develop pretty good radar for crazy, and apparently my family was pinging their crazy detector harder than I was. My jaw tightened as I processed what she was really telling me. The people who couldn't be bothered to show up for my birthday were now so concerned about my whereabouts that they'd called the police. Not concerned enough to actually call me directly, mind you, or to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, their behavior had something to do with my absence. Just concerned enough to turn my disappearance into someone else's problem. If they show up here again, I said, and I made sure my voice carried the kind of quiet authority that people don't usually argue with, I'll file for a protective order. Both officers nodded, and I could tell they weren't surprised by this response. They'd probably seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times. Family members using law enforcement as a weapon in personal disputes, turning welfare checks into harassment tools. Anita walked them out of the conference room, playing the perfect professional host, even though I could tell she was dying to know what the hell was going on. She came back a few minutes later, closed the door behind her, and slid a bottle of water across the table to me, without saying anything. We sat there in silence for a moment. The quarterly budget reports spread out between us like evidence of a normal life that had just been temporarily interrupted by police officers and family drama. Whatever this is, Anita finally said, her voice carrying the kind of straightforward kindness that cuts through bullshit like a hot knife through butter. You're not alone. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those words until they hit me. For the past week, I'd been operating under the assumption that I was completely isolated, that my decision to set boundaries had somehow made me the villain in everyone else's story. But sitting there in that conference room, looking at Anita's concerned but supportive face, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there were people in my life who actually gave a damn about me as a person rather than as a funding source. Thanks, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. That night, I sat in my hotel room staring at the ceiling for about an hour, trying to process the fact that my own wife had called the cops on me for the crime of not answering my phone for 2 days. 2 days. Not 2 months. Not 2 years. 48 hours of radio silence. And suddenly, I'm a missing person case. The audacity was so breathtaking it almost deserved some kind of award. But you know what? Maybe it was time to stop being surprised by the audacity and start documenting it instead. So I did something I probably should have done years ago. I went home to gather evidence of exactly how screwed up my financial life had become. The house felt different when I walked in around 9 p.m. Not physically different. Same furniture, same slightly broken ceiling fan in the living room, same stack of mail on the kitchen counter that nobody ever seems to deal with. But emotionally, it felt like walking into a crime scene where I was both the victim and the detective trying to solve my own case. Marisol wasn't home, which was probably for the best considering I wasn't in the mood for another conversation about family obligations and why I was being so unreasonable about money. I grabbed my laptop, a legal pad, and every financial document I could find, then spread it all out on our kitchen table like I was preparing for the world's most depressing tax audit. Let me tell you something about keeping receipts. Most people are terrible at it. They shove everything into junk drawers and shoe boxes, and then act surprised when they can't find proof of anything. But me? I'm apparently a masochist who keeps detailed records of his own financial abuse. Every wire transfer, every canceled check, every credit card statement going back 5 years, all neatly organized in folders because I'm the kind of person who thinks being organized will somehow protect me from chaos. Turns out, being organized just makes it easier to see exactly how much chaos you've been funding. I started with Gregory's roof repair from 3 years ago. The man called me on a Tuesday morning, voice all shaky with panic, talking about how a storm had damaged his roof and insurance was being difficult, and he needed $8,000 immediately or the whole house might collapse. Being the dutiful son-in-law, I transferred the money that same day. Did I ever see an insurance report? Nope. Did Gregory ever pay me back? Also nope. Did I ever even see photos of this allegedly catastrophic roof damage? Take a wild guess. But Gregory's emergency roof was just the beginning of my journey through the Hale Family Financial Hall of Fame. Next up was Bianca's boutique launch, which apparently required $15,000 for inventory and setup costs. Bianca had this whole business plan that she presented during Sunday dinner, complete with a PowerPoint presentation about sustainable fashion and market demographics. She made it sound like she was about to become the next big thing in retail, and honestly, I got caught up in her enthusiasm. The boutique lasted exactly 7 months before she decided that retail was too stressful, and she wanted to focus on her yoga certification instead. Then there was Trevor's crypto catastrophe, which still makes my eye twitch when I think about it. That brilliant investment strategy cost me $12,000 after Trevor called me sobbing, actual sobbing, about how he'd put his entire savings into some cryptocurrency called Moondoge or Doge Rocket, or some other ridiculous name that should have been a red flag visible from space. Patrice got on the phone after him, talking about how he was learning valuable lessons about financial responsibility and how family helps family through difficult times. Apparently, helping family meant writing checks to cover their gambling addiction to digital currencies named after memes. As I went through each folder, each receipt, each wire confirmation, a pattern emerged that was so obvious I felt stupid for not seeing it earlier. Every emergency happened to occur right around the time I got a bonus at work or a tax refund or some other influx of cash. Every crisis was urgent enough to require immediate financial intervention, but never quite urgent enough for anyone to explore other options first. The medical bills were particularly infuriating. Gregory's emergency procedures that somehow never involved actual emergencies. Patrice's dental work that was medically necessary, even though it looked suspiciously like cosmetic improvements. Even Marisol's therapy sessions, which she claimed were for anxiety, but seemed to focus mainly on how to ask me for money more effectively. By midnight, I had tallied up 5 years of Hale family expenses, and the number made me physically nauseous. We're talking about enough money to buy a decent car, or put a down payment on a vacation home, or fund a pretty substantial retirement account. Instead, it had all disappeared into the black hole of other people's poor life choices and manufactured emergencies. But the real gut punch came when I started looking at my own marriage through this financial lens. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through text messages from Marisol over the past year. And Jesus Christ, it was like reading a greatest hits collection of manipulation tactics. "You know how my parents are," she'd text after yet another request for money. As if Gregory and Patrice's inability to manage their finances was some kind of natural disaster that we all just had to accept, like hurricanes or tax season. "Just this once," she'd say about expenses that happened with suspicious regularity. Apparently, Marisol's definition of just this once was more flexible than a yoga instructor on steroids. "We'll square it later" was another favorite, which roughly translated to, "I'll bring this up again in 6 months when you've forgotten about it, and make you feel guilty for asking." And my personal favorite, "It's what married couples do." Because apparently, being married meant signing up to fund your in-laws' lifestyle while your own birthday party sat empty, because everyone was too busy spending your money to actually spend time with you. I remembered that empty table at Velvet Room, the cake I cut for myself, the walk to my car that felt like a funeral procession for my self-respect. And then, a week later, not love, not apology, not even acknowledgement, just another fucking invoice. That's when I made the decision that should have been obvious years ago. Separate finances, separate passwords, separate everything. If love came with this many itemized expenses, then maybe it wasn't actually love at all. I wrote down my new rule on a sticky note and stuck it to my laptop screen. Rule 1. I will not fund disrespect. Simple, clear, and long overdue. The next morning, I woke up in my hotel room with the kind of clarity that usually only comes after a really good fever breaks. You know that feeling when you've been sick for days and suddenly your head clears and you can think straight again? That's exactly what it felt like, except instead of being sick with the flu, I'd been sick with 8 years of financial Stockholm syndrome. I ordered room service coffee, the good stuff, not the swill they usually serve at corporate hotels, and made a list on hotel stationery. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a strategic battle plan for reclaiming my financial independence. Time to cut off the money pipeline that had been feeding the Hale family circus for way too long. First stop, the bank. Now, most people think of banks as these intimidating institutions full of people in suits who judge you for overdraft fees. But when you're trying to protect yourself from financial predators who happen to share your last name, banks become your best friend. They have all these lovely security features that most people never need to use, but which become absolutely essential when your spouse and her family treat your bank account like their personal ATM. I called the main customer service line and explained that I needed to speak with someone in fraud prevention. Because let's be honest, that's exactly what this was, fraud. Just because it was being committed by people I was legally related to didn't make it any less fraudulent. The customer service rep transferred me to Halima Yusuf, who had one of those calm, professional voices that immediately made me feel like I was talking to someone who'd seen every type of financial fuckery known to mankind. She probably dealt with situations like mine every day. People who suddenly realized they'd been funding other people's lives while their own went down the drain. I need to remove spousal view on all my accounts, I told her, getting straight to the point, and revoke all external connections to joint accounts. Of course, Mr. Blake, Halima said without missing a beat. Can you verify your social security number and date of birth for me? After I confirmed my identity, she walked me through the process like a surgeon explaining a procedure. Every authorization Marisol had to view my personal accounts, gone. Every automatic transfer set up between our joint account and her personal spending, terminated. Every notification she received about my financial activity, canceled. What about the discretionary joint account? Halima asked, referring to the account we'd set up for household expenses that had somehow become a slush fund for Hale family emergencies. Freeze it, I said. Complete freeze. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out without my explicit authorization. Do you want two-factor authentication on all transactions going forward? She asked, and I could practically hear her taking notes. Yes, text and token. Because if I was going to protect my money from people who thought love came with payment plans, I was going to do it right. The whole conversation took maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like I was performing financial surgery on my own life. Every security measure we put in place, every access point we closed off, every protection we activated, it all felt like building a fortress around the one thing I had left that was actually mine. Next up was the mortgage company, because of course Gregory had made several helpful suggestions over the years about improving our equity position and maximizing our investment potential. Translation: he'd been fishing for ways to get access to our home's value for his own projects. I called and put a freeze on any changes to our home loan. No equity lines of credit, no refinancing, no modifications without both signatures and notarized documents. The customer service rep there was less chatty than Halima, but equally efficient. Done, she said after I explained what I needed. Any attempts to modify the loan will require in-person verification from both account holders. Perfect. If Gregory wanted to get his hands on my house, he'd have to do it the hard way. Then I called my accountant, Rory Chun, who'd been doing my taxes for the past 5 years and had probably noticed the suspicious number of family loan deductions I'd been claiming. Rory's one of those guys who notices everything but never asks questions unless you want him to, which is exactly the kind of accountant you want when your personal life is more complicated than your tax situation. Rory, it's Jared, I said when he picked up. I need you to flag my accounts for any attempts to open credit in my name. Identity theft, he asked, and I could hear him already pulling up my file. Something like that, I said. Just make sure nobody can use my information to open loans or credit lines without going through you first. Consider it done. Anything else I should know about? Probably, but let's start there. The final call was the most important one, my lawyer, Priya Patel. I'd met Priya 3 years ago when we bought the house, and she'd handled all the legal paperwork with the kind of thoroughness that made me feel confident I was protected from any surprises. She was exactly the kind of attorney you want in your corner when things get messy, smart, direct, and completely unimpressed by people who think family relationships give them special legal privileges. Priya, it's Jared Blake, I said when her assistant put me through. I need a full family financial audit, what I've paid for in the last 5 years. How detailed? She asked, and I could hear her pen clicking, which meant she was already taking notes. Everything. Every transfer, every loan, every emergency expense. I want documentation of every dollar I've given to my wife's family, and I want legal options for recovery. If we have to, will you litigate to recover? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Was I really prepared to take my wife's family to court over money? Was I ready to turn this private family drama into a public legal battle? Priya, I said, thinking about my empty birthday party and that text demanding $1,800 like I was some kind of family ATM. I turned 40 last week. I'm finally sure about a lot of things. I'll start the audit today, she said. Give me 2 weeks for a complete analysis. After I hung up, I sat back in my hotel room chair and looked at my list. Every item was checked off. Every financial vulnerability was now protected. Every pipeline that had been draining my resources was now shut off. It felt like I'd just performed major surgery on my own life, and the patient was finally stable. For the first time in years, my money was actually mine again. My accounts were protected, my credit was secure, and my attorney was building a case that would make the Hale family's financial parasitism a matter of legal record. I ordered another cup of coffee and started planning phase 2. The next afternoon, I was actually having a pretty decent day at work. You know how sometimes everything just clicks? I'd finished 3 presentations ahead of schedule, helped solve a client crisis that had been brewing for weeks, and even managed to grab lunch without anyone asking me to fund their life choices. I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I could build some kind of normal routine while I figured out what the hell to do with my marriage. Then my phone rang with a call from building security. Mr. Blake? This is Marcus downstairs. You've got some visitors in the lobby, and they're, He paused, clearly trying to find diplomatic language for whatever shit show was happening on the ground floor. They're pretty insistent about seeing you. My stomach dropped because I had a pretty good idea who they were. Let me guess. 3 women, one of them claiming to be my wife. That's them. Should I send them up? Absolutely not. I'll be right down. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the elevator, running through possible scenarios in my head. None of them were good. The fact that Marisol had brought backup suggested this wasn't going to be a calm, rational conversation about our relationship issues. This was going to be an ambush, probably with Patrice leading the charge and Bianca providing moral support in the form of eye rolls and dramatic sighs. The elevator ride felt like descending into hell, if hell had Muzak and corporate motivational posters about teamwork. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I could hear them before I could see them. Specifically, I could hear Patrice's voice echoing through the marble lobby like she was addressing a shareholders' meeting instead of harassing her son-in-law at his workplace. They were standing near the reception desk in formation like some kind of dysfunctional girl group. Marisol in the center looking furious, Patrice on her right looking indignant, and Bianca on her left looking like she'd rather be literally anywhere else but had been drafted into this intervention against her will. Marcus, the security guard, was standing nearby with the kind of expression that suggested he'd seen some weird shit in his career, but this was definitely making the highlight reel. He caught my eye and gave me a look that said, "Good luck, buddy. You're gonna need it." Marisol spotted me first and immediately launched into attack mode. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the lobby loud enough that people waiting for elevators were starting to stare. "You froze the cards. Not 'how are you doing?' or 'I missed you,' or 'can we talk about this privately?' Just straight to the accusation, like I was some kind of criminal for protecting my own money. The audacity was so breathtaking I had to admire it, in the same way you might admire a particularly impressive car crash. Patrice stepped forward, and I could see she was gearing up for one of her legendary guilt trips. "Gregory's milestone is this weekend," she hissed, like I had somehow forgotten about the party I'd been asked to fund via text message. "He deserves it." The word "deserves" hit me like a slap in the face. Gregory deserves a party that costs his family members $1,800 each, but I didn't deserve a wife showing up to my birthday. Gregory deserves financial support for his celebrations, but I don't deserve basic respect in my own marriage. The double standard was so obvious it should have come with flashing neon signs. "I deserved a wife at my birthday," I said, keeping my voice level even though every word felt like I was swallowing glass. Bianca rolled her eyes so hard I'm surprised she didn't strain something. "This isn't about your little party," she said with the kind of dismissive tone that made it clear she thought my feelings were about as important as a hangnail. And that's when something inside me snapped. Not in a loud, explosive way, more like a quiet, decisive break, like a rope that's been fraying for years finally giving way. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make a scene, didn't give them the dramatic reaction they were probably expecting. "That's the problem," I said, looking directly at each of them in turn. Nothing is about me, except the bill. The silence that followed was beautiful. You could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they tried to process the fact that their personal ATM had just grown a backbone. Patrice's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Bianca suddenly found the marble floor fascinating, and Marisol looked like I'd just spoken to her in a foreign language. I could see Marcus shifting his weight, ready to intervene if this turned physical, and several other people in the lobby were not so subtly listening to our conversation. Because nothing says functional family relationships like screaming about money in a corporate office building. We're done talking in public, I continued, still keeping my voice calm and professional. Email my lawyer. That got their attention. Marisol's eyes flashed with something that might have been panic mixed with rage. You're going to regret this, Jared, she said, and her voice had that particular edge that meant she was about to say something she couldn't take back. But you know what? I'd already heard every threat, every guilt trip, every manipulation tactic in the Hale family playbook. I'd been funding their dysfunction for so long that I'd memorized all their greatest hits. The angry demands, the tears, the accusations that I was being selfish or unreasonable or whatever other words they used to describe someone who dared to set boundaries. I shook my head, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I felt completely calm while talking to my wife. I already regret waiting this long, I said, and I meant it. I regretted every dollar I'd transferred, every emergency I'd funded, every time I'd said yes when I should have said hell no. I regretted the years I'd spent thinking that love meant being a human credit card for people who couldn't be bothered to show up for my birthday. Patrice tried to jump back in with something about family loyalty and obligations, but I held up my hand, and she actually stopped talking. Amazing what a little backbone could accomplish. Marcus, I called over to security. If these ladies need directions out of the building, please help them. Then I turned around and walked back to the elevator without another word, leaving them standing in the lobby like tourists who'd just realized they were in the wrong city. The elevator doors closed on whatever response they were formulating, and I rode back up to my floor feeling lighter than I had in years. When I got back to my desk, I found a text from Priya. Audit update. Preliminary numbers are substantial. Can you come in tomorrow to review? I smiled and typed back, absolutely. It's time to settle some accounts. Walking into Priya's law office the next morning felt like stepping into an alternate universe where competence and professionalism actually existed. You know how some lawyers' offices look like they were decorated by someone who thought intimidating was the same as impressive? Dark wood everywhere, leather-bound books that probably haven't been opened since the Carter administration, portraits of stern-looking dead guys in wigs. Yeah, Priya's office was nothing like that. Her space was modern, clean, and efficient. White walls, minimalist furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in enough natural light to actually read documents without squinting. Everything about it said, I solve problems, rather than, I charge you by the hour to make you feel small. Which was exactly what I needed right now, because I was about to get a very expensive education in just how badly I'd been screwed over. Priya was waiting for me with a stack of papers that looked thick enough to stop a bullet, and her expression was the kind of carefully neutral that lawyers master when they're about to deliver news that's going to ruin someone's day. She gestured for me to sit down across from her desk, and I noticed she had 2 cups of coffee ready, one for me, one for her. Either she was being thoughtful, or she knew I was going to need caffeine to process whatever she was about to tell me. Before we start, she said, sliding the coffee toward me, I want you to know that in 20 years of practicing law, I've rarely seen financial documentation this thorough. Most people keep receipts like they're collecting baseball cards, randomly and with no system whatsoever. You, on the other hand, apparently document everything like you're expecting an audit from the IRS. I took a sip of coffee and tried to decide if that was a compliment or just a professional observation. Is that good or bad? In this case, very good, because what I'm about to show you would be almost impossible to prove without the level of detail you provided. She opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper that looked like it had been printed by the world's most depressing accountant. The total amount you've paid for Hale family expenses over the past 5 years, she said, turning the paper toward me, is $86,400. I stared at that number like it was written in hieroglyphics. $86,400. That wasn't just money, that was a car. A nice car. That was a down payment on a house, or a year of salary for some people, or a pretty substantial chunk of retirement savings. That was enough money to fund my own life instead of subsidizing everyone else's poor decisions. Jesus Christ, I said, because sometimes the only appropriate response to discovering you've been financially gang-raped by your own family is mild blasphemy. It gets more specific, Priya continued, flipping to the next page. Gregory's medical deductibles and procedures, $14,600. Bianca's boutique launch and subsequent business expenses, $15,300. Trevor's debt settlement after his cryptocurrency adventure, $12,800. She was reading these numbers like items on a grocery list, but each one hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't just random expenses. These were specific, documented instances of me being treated like a human ATM by people who couldn't even be bothered to show up for my birthday. Then we have the smaller but more frequent expenses, she continued. Patrice's charity brunch catering, for $1,200. Various credit card payoffs for the family, $18,700. And my personal favorite, a dozen different emergencies ranging from car repairs to veterinary bills, totaling $20,800. I did some quick math in my head and realized she wasn't even done yet. That's only about $85,000. What's the other $1,400? Priya smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile lawyers get when they're about to deliver a particularly satisfying piece of evidence. Interest calculations. If you had invested that money in a basic index fund instead of funding the Hale family lifestyle, you'd have earned approximately $1,400 in interest over the same time period. So not only had I been financially abused for 5 years, but I'd also missed out on the money that money could have made. It was like discovering that someone had been stealing from you and also preventing you from earning anything on what they stole. The mathematical precision of my own stupidity was almost impressive. What are my options? I asked, because sitting there feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get my money back. Priya pulled out another document that looked official and intimidating. I've drafted a demand letter. It outlines every expense, provides documentation for each transaction, and gives them 30 days to repay the full amount or we file suit for recovery. All of it, plus legal fees if we have to go to court. She slid the letter across the desk, and I read through it with growing amazement. It was like reading the world's most professional fuck you letter, written in legal language that somehow managed to be both polite and absolutely devastating. Every expense was listed, every date was documented, every dollar was accounted for. It was beautiful in the way that perfect revenge is beautiful, clean, precise, and completely justified. Send it, I said. Priya nodded and made a note in her file. I'll have it delivered by certified mail this afternoon. That starts the 30-day clock. As if on cue, my phone rang. Marisol's contact photo, a smiling picture from our anniversary dinner 2 years ago, popped up on the screen like a ghost from a happier past. I let it go to voicemail, but she called back immediately. Then again, answer it, Priya suggested, but put it on speaker. I want to witness this conversation. I hit the speaker button and tried to prepare myself for whatever emotional manipulation was about to come through the phone. Hello, Marisol. You're suing my family? Her voice was thick with anger and something that might have been tears, but I'd learned not to trust Marisol's tears anymore. They had a way of appearing whenever her family's access to my money was threatened. I'm asking for repayment, I said, keeping my voice level. Suing is step 2. What followed was a 10-minute masterclass in guilt, manipulation, and emotional blackmail. She talked about loyalty and sacrifice, about how family members support each other through difficult times, about how I was being petty and vindictive over money that we could afford to give. She used every argument I'd heard a dozen times before, every excuse that had worked in the past to make me feel guilty for wanting my own financial security. But sitting there in Priya's office, looking at $86,000 worth of documented evidence that my marriage had become a business transaction where I was the only one paying, something had fundamentally changed. I'm loyal to people who are loyal to me, I said when she finally paused for breath. To start, loyal people attend their husband's 40th. Then I hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Gregory. I played it on speaker and listened to him talk about man-to-man respect and how real men handle things differently, and how disappointed he was in my behavior. I saved the voicemail and looked at Priya. Evidence. Evidence, she confirmed. Respect has a line item now. The next few weeks were like watching a masterclass in how quickly people's priorities can shift when their access to free money gets cut off. It's amazing how resourceful the Hale family suddenly became when they realized that their personal bank, aka me, had officially closed for business and wasn't taking any more deposits from the Karma account. The first sign that my demand letter had hit its target came exactly 3 days after Priya sent it. I was checking real estate listings online during my lunch break, not because I was planning to move, but because I was curious about what $86,000 could have bought me in terms of actual assets instead of funding other people's lifestyle choices. When I got a text from Bianca, "Did you see? They listed the cabin." Attached was a link to a real estate listing for Gregory and Patrice's weekend cabin up in the mountains. You know, the same cabin where they'd hosted family gatherings for years, the one Gregory was always talking about leaving to his grandchildren someday. The one that Patrice had decorated with rustic furniture that cost more than most people's cars. The listing price was $42,000, which was probably about half what they'd paid for it, but desperate people don't usually get top dollar for their assets. I screenshot the listing and sent it to Priya with a message, "Progress." 2 days later, Luis Ortega from my team mentioned seeing a vintage motorcycle for sale on Craigslist that looked exactly like the one Gregory was always bragging about. "Beautiful bike," Luis said. "Some old guy selling it for way less than it's worth. Seemed pretty desperate to move it fast." I looked up the listing and sure enough, there was Gregory's pride and joy, a 1973 Harley-Davidson that he'd restored himself and loved more than some people love their children. The asking price was $8,000, which was probably half what that bike was actually worth. Gregory had spent 3 years rebuilding that motorcycle from the ground up, and now he was selling it like he was fleeing the country. But my personal favorite development came from Bianca's increasingly creative attempts to negotiate her way out of the financial hole she'd helped dig. She sent me a text that was so transparently desperate it almost deserved an award for creativity. "Hey Jared, I know things are weird right now, but what if I could work something out with store inventory? I still have a lot of pieces from the boutique that never sold. High-end stuff, real value. Maybe we could call it even on some of what I owe." Store inventory. She wanted to pay me back with unsold clothes from her failed business venture. The same clothes that hadn't been good enough to keep her boutique from failing were somehow supposed to settle a $15,000 debt. The audacity was so breathtaking it was almost artistic. I forwarded the text to Priya without comment, because sometimes evidence speaks for itself. But the real masterpiece of desperation came from Trevor, who apparently decided that our previous relationship as brothers-in-law meant we were somehow buddies who could work things out with a casual text conversation. "Bro, we're family," he texted at 11:30 on a Thursday night, probably after a few drinks had convinced him that charm and brotherhood could solve his $12,000 problem. "This whole legal thing is crazy. Can't we just figure something out between us? You know I'm good for it eventually." Eventually. That was the magic word that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. Eventually was how Gregory's roof repair had turned into a permanent gift. Eventually was how Bianca's business loan had become a donation to her yoga certification fund. Eventually was the Hale family's favorite word, right after emergency and just this once. I typed back, "Then act like it. Short, sweet, and to the point." Because if Trevor wanted to play the family card, he could start by acting like someone who actually gave a shit about family relationships instead of just family bank accounts. The week after that, Luis dragged me to the gym after work, probably because he'd noticed I was spending my lunch breaks researching litigation strategies instead of eating actual food. Luis is one of those naturally optimistic people who thinks every problem can be solved with enough endorphins and protein shakes, and honestly, I was ready to try anything that didn't involve family therapy or meditation apps. "You're wound tighter than a Swiss watch," he said as we warmed up on the treadmill. "Whatever's going on at home, you need to burn some of that stress off before it kills you." He was right. I'd been carrying so much anger and frustration that my shoulders were permanently hunched, like I was bracing for the next financial ambush. An hour of lifting heavy things and putting them down again did more for my mental state than any amount of rational analysis or legal strategizing. The endorphins worked like magic, washing away the constant background anxiety that had become my default emotional state. For the first time in weeks, I felt like a human being instead of a stress-filled ATM with abandonment issues. Walking home from the gym, I ran into Mrs. Okoye, my neighbor from 2 houses down. She's this tiny Nigerian woman who somehow manages to grow the most beautiful garden in the neighborhood and always seems to know exactly what's going on in everyone's life without being nosy about it. "Jared," she called out as I was checking my mail. "I made too much jollof rice again. You take some home." She pressed a foil-wrapped plate into my hands before I could protest, and the smell was absolutely incredible. "Mrs. Okoye, you don't have to." "Nonsense," she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "You look too thin and too worried. Sometimes the best thing for worry is good food and good boundaries." I must have looked surprised because she smiled and patted my arm. "Boundaries are the fence that keeps the goats out of your garden," she said. "Without the fence, the goats eat everything and leave you with nothing but dirt." I laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in my chest instead of the bitter, sarcastic chuckles that had become my default response to absurdity. "Thank you, Mrs. Okoye, for the food and the wisdom." "The food is free," she said with a wink. "The wisdom costs extra, but for you, today it's complimentary." That evening, I sat in my hotel room eating the best jollof rice I'd ever tasted and checking my email. Priya had sent an update. Partial payments totaling $19,000 posted to the account. Gregory sold assets. Bianca liquidated something. Trevor apparently borrowed from friends. It's a start. 19,000 out of 86,000. Not even a quarter of what they owed me, but it was progress. More importantly, it was proof that they could find money when they absolutely had to, which meant all those years of "we just don't have it" had been complete bullshit. I replied to Priya, "It's a start. What's our next move?" A line had been drawn, and for once, I was the one holding the chalk. 3 weeks into what I'd started calling the Great Hale family liquidation event, something unexpected happened. I started to feel normal again. Not the fake normal I'd been performing for years while my bank account got drained by other people's emergencies, but actual, genuine normal. The kind of normal where you can make plans without calculating whether you'll have enough money left after someone else's crisis hits your Venmo. So when Anita suggested organizing a team bowling night, I said yes without checking my phone for family group chats or wondering how much Gregory's latest medical procedure was going to cost me. It felt revolutionary to accept a social invitation based solely on whether I actually wanted to go, rather than whether I could afford whatever financial ambush was waiting for me at home. The bowling alley was one of those places that probably looked exactly the same as it did in 1987. Neon lights, polyester carpet that had seen better decades, and the kind of background music that made you nostalgic for times you weren't even alive for. But you know what? It was perfect. The neon hum felt like the soundtrack to a life that was finally mine again, without anyone asking me to fund their portion of the electric bill. I was lining up for my second frame, actually enjoying myself for the first time in months, when I caught sight of someone familiar 2 lanes down. Gregory Hale, moving slower than I remembered, with the kind of careful deliberation that comes from either injury or the weight of consequences finally catching up with you. For a moment, I considered pretending I hadn't seen him. It would have been easy enough. The bowling alley was crowded, the lighting was dim, and I could have just focused on my game until he left. But something about the way he was moving, the way his shoulders were hunched like he was carrying something heavy, made me pause. He caught my eye before I could decide whether to acknowledge him or not, and for a few seconds we just stared at each other across 2 lanes of polyester carpet and family drama. Then, to my complete surprise, he put down his bowling ball and walked over. "Jared," he said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Gone was the booming confidence I'd gotten used to over 8 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings. This was a man who'd been selling his prized possessions to pay debts he'd never expected to be called on. "Gregory," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I wasn't going to be rude. We were in public, and I'm not an asshole. But I also wasn't going to pretend we were just running into each other at a friendly social event, instead of in the middle of a financial reckoning I'd been forced to initiate. He held up his hands in what looked like surrender, palms facing me. "Jared, I was wrong to ignore your birthday," he said, and the words came out like they'd been rehearsed, but also like they'd cost him something to say. "I'm sorry. Sorry." Gregory Hale, the man who'd never apologized for anything in the 8 years I'd known him, was standing in a bowling alley telling me he was sorry. Not sorry for treating me like an ATM, not sorry for the $86,000 his family had extracted from my bank account, but sorry for ignoring my birthday. It was a start, I guess, but it was also exactly the kind of limited apology I'd learned to expect from people who were really only sorry they'd gotten caught. I didn't rush to forgive him. I'd spent too many years accepting half-hearted apologies and partial acknowledgments of wrongdoing, treating crumbs of accountability like they were full meals of actual remorse. Instead, I just nodded and picked up my bowling ball. "Want to bowl a frame?" I asked. He nodded, and we played one frame without speaking. There was something almost meditative about it. The weight of the ball, the sound of pins falling, the simple physics of aim and follow-through. It felt like the first honest interaction Gregory and I had ever had, because nobody was asking for money and nobody was making excuses for why they needed it. I bowled a decent strike. Gregory managed to knock down 8 pins with 2 throws, which was respectable for a man who'd been selling his prized possessions to pay off debts. We watched each other's technique with the kind of careful attention that had nothing to do with bowling and everything to do with trying to figure out how to have a conversation about 8 years of financial dysfunction. Finally, as I was lining up for my next frame, Gregory spoke again. "I taught my kids that money fixes everything," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of pins crashing and 80s music echoing through the alley. That was my mistake. There it was. Not a full admission of guilt, not an acknowledgement of the specific damage his family had done to my financial and emotional well-being, but something that felt like the beginning of actual honesty. He'd raised his children to believe that other people's money could solve their problems, and now they were all dealing with the consequences of that philosophy. I finished my throw, a spare, which felt appropriate, and turned to look at him. "Teach them what respect costs," I said. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't forgiveness either. It was simply the truth. Respect costs something, and for too long, his family had been getting it for free while I paid the bills. We shook hands then, the kind of handshake that belongs to endings rather than beginnings. It was firm, brief, and final. Not the handshake of reconciliation, but the handshake of two men who finally understood where they stood with each other. I paid for my lane and left without another word, walking out into the parking lot with the feeling that I'd just witnessed something important. Not a happy ending. Not a moment of dramatic forgiveness or family reunion, but something quieter and more real, the acknowledgement that some relationships don't survive the transition from dysfunction to honesty. Driving home to my hotel, I thought about the difference between apologizing for specific actions and apologizing for the character flaws that made those actions inevitable. Gregory was sorry he'd ignored my birthday, but I wasn't sure he was sorry for raising children who thought love came with invoices attached. He was sorry I'd been hurt, but I wasn't sure he was sorry for creating a family culture where hurting me was considered acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of financial comfort. But you know what? That was Gregory's work to figure out, not mine. I'd spent 8 years trying to fix other people's relationships with money and responsibility, and all it had gotten me was an empty birthday party and a legal demand for $86,000 in restitution. From now on, the only person I was responsible for fixing was myself. The neon glow of the bowling alley disappeared in my rearview mirror, and I drove toward my hotel room feeling lighter than I had in years. Some conversations end with forgiveness, some end with anger, and some end with the quiet understanding that certain chapters of your life are finally, definitively closed. This felt like the third kind. Back home. And it was strange how the hotel had started feeling more like home than the house I'd been paying a mortgage on for 3 years. I sat down at the small desk by the window and did something I probably should have done months ago. I wrote down rules. Not suggestions, not guidelines, not the kind of wishy-washy boundaries that dissolve the moment someone starts crying about family loyalty, but actual, non-negotiable rules for how I was going to live the rest of my life. I grabbed one of those little yellow sticky notes from the hotel desk supplies and wrote in careful block letters. 1. I am a husband, not a wallet. 2. If love needs an invoice, it isn't love. 3. Boundaries stay even when people get loud. 3 rules. Simple enough to remember, specific enough to enforce, and comprehensive enough to cover pretty much every type of financial manipulation the Hale family had thrown at me over the past 8 years. I stuck the note to the edge of my laptop screen, where I'd see it every time I opened my computer, a little yellow reminder that I was finally learning to put myself first. As if the universe wanted to test my resolve immediately, my phone buzzed with a text from Priya, last transfer in. They're still short. I'll pursue the remainder. I looked at the message for a long moment, thinking about what pursue the remainder meant in legal terms. More letters, more deadlines, possibly court dates and depositions, and all the expensive, time-consuming machinery of the justice system grinding away at what was left of my relationship with Marisol's family. Proceed, I typed back. 2 letters, 7 characters, but it felt like signing a declaration of independence from 8 years of financial servitude. Whatever happened next, whether they came up with the rest of the money, whether we ended up in court, whether this whole mess destroyed what was left of my marriage, I was done being the person who absorbed other people's consequences while they got to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. With that decision made, I did something that felt almost rebellious in its simplicity. I ordered myself a birthday cake. Not from some fancy bakery with artisanal this and organic that, but from the little corner bakery I'd walk past every morning on my way to get coffee. The kind of place where the owner knows everyone's name and the cakes taste like childhood birthdays instead of Instagram photo opportunities. Giuseppe, the same Italian baker who'd made my original birthday cake, the one I'd eaten alone in that beautiful, empty lounge, recognized me immediately. "Mr. Jared," he said with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that made me remember why I'd liked this neighborhood in the first place. How was the party? I could have lied. Could have told him it was wonderful, that everyone loved the cake, that it was exactly the celebration I'd hoped for. But standing there in his warm, flower-scented shop, surrounded by cases full of simple, honest food made by someone who clearly took pride in his work, I decided to tell the truth. "It was just me," I said, "but the cake was perfect." Giuseppe's face went through several expressions: surprise, understanding, something that might have been sympathy, but felt more like recognition. "Ah," he said finally. "Sometimes the best parties are the quiet ones." He made me another cake, smaller this time, but with the same thick buttercream frosting that had been the one bright spot of my original birthday disaster. Simple yellow cake with vanilla frosting, no message this time, just a cake for the sake of having a cake. "How much?" I asked when he handed it to me in a white bakery box tied with string. "For the man who eats his birthday cake alone?" Giuseppe shook his head. "This one is on the house. But next year, you bring friends." I carried that cake back to my hotel room like it was made of gold instead of sugar and flour. There was something almost ceremonial about the whole thing. The walk through the lobby, the elevator ride to my floor, the careful placement of the box on the small table by the window. This wasn't a consolation prize or an attempt to recreate something that had gone wrong. This was a celebration of something that had finally gone right. I cut myself a generous slice, because if you're going to eat cake alone, you might as well eat good cake in appropriate quantities, and sat down at my laptop to check my email. There was the usual work stuff, a few newsletters I'd been meaning to unsubscribe from, and one message that made me pause. An email from HR with the subject line, "Workplace Policy Reminder." I opened it, already knowing what it was going to say. Someone in the company, probably someone who'd witnessed Marisol's lobby ambush, had decided it was worth documenting for future reference. The email was professionally worded but clear. Any future wellness checks or family visits to the office should be routed through the legal department for appropriate handling. I replied with a simple, understood and agreed, then added a note requesting that this policy be applied to any future visits from family members, regardless of the stated purpose. Because if there's one thing I'd learned from this whole experience, it's that people who don't respect boundaries tend to keep testing them until you make the consequences too expensive to ignore. With that administrative detail handled, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I powered down my phone completely. Not airplane mode, not do not disturb, but completely off. The little screen went black, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was truly unreachable. The silence was incredible. No pings from family group chats asking for money. No calls from people who needed me to solve their latest crisis. No texts demanding explanations for why I wasn't funding their lifestyle choices anymore. Just quiet, peaceful silence that belonged entirely to me. I ate my cake slowly, savoring Giuseppe's excellent work and the strange luxury of eating something I'd chosen for myself, paid for with my own money, without having to calculate whether I'd have enough left over for someone else's emergency. The buttercream was perfect, not too sweet, with that slightly salty edge that separated good frosting from the grocery store stuff. When I was done, I looked around my hotel room, my temporary kingdom of financial independence, and tried to figure out what 40 was supposed to feel like. The birthday cards and surprise parties I'd imagined hadn't materialized, but something else had: clarity. For the first time in years, I knew exactly where I stood, exactly what I was worth, and exactly what I wasn't willing to tolerate anymore. 40 hadn't arrived with balloons or surprise guests or heartfelt speeches about how much people valued me. It had arrived with legal documents and demand letters, and the quiet satisfaction of finally choosing myself over people who'd spent years choosing my money over me. No apology from Marisol. No card acknowledging that maybe she should have shown up for her husband's milestone birthday. No recognition that 8 years of treating me like a human credit card might have been less than ideal relationship strategy. But you know what? I didn't need their apologies anymore. I had something better: a clean room, a quiet mind, and the knowledge that I'd finally learned the difference between love and a business transaction where only one person was paying. 40 was finally, completely, entirely mine.